Okay, thank you for joining us in a video here. So if I've not met you, my name is Aaron. I'm the preaching pastor at Red Village Church, and we're glad that you can join us in this time. So if you have a Bible with you, if you'd open up to the book of Ezra. And so this is an Old Testament book that we've been studying for several weeks now. And so I'm going to be reading to you from chapter 8, which is our next passage in our study. And I'm reading verses 21 through 23, but our study will be of the entire chapter 8 of Ezra. So please hear these words. So the scripture says, "Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river of Ahava, that we might humble ourselves before our God, to seek him for a safe journey for ourselves, our children, and all our goods. For I was ashamed to ask the king for a band of soldiers and horsemen to protect us against the enemy on our way. Since we told the king, the hand of our God is for good on all who seek him, and the power of his wrath is against all who forsake him. So we fasted and implored our God for this, and he listened to our entreaty." So to start off this time here, let me share 3 quick stories that I've actually continued to circle around in my own thoughts as we studied through the book of Ezra. So the first story comes from when I was in seminary. And the class I was in was reading a book titled The Quest for Godliness, which is a book written by a man named J.I. Packer. And this book told just a different number of stories from the Puritans. And in one of the lectures, the professor pointed out that one of the pastors, Puritan pastors, briefly mentioned this book is a pastor named Richard Grenham, who evidently was a hardworking, faithful pastor, a gifted counselor. Yet at the end of his life, as Grenham reflected back on his ministry, he wrote in a journal how little influence he felt he had in his life. He never really had a big ministry, really. Outside of his church, he really wasn't known. If it wasn't for J.I. Packer doing a good amount of digging into the Puritans, Grenham probably would have been lost to history. And in this lecture, my professor, as he's sharing all these different details concerning Richard Grenham, his life, he looked out at us, the class, filled with aspiring pastors, and he let us know, men, someday this actually is going to be you. You're going to be Richard Grenham's. You're not going to be some type of rare outlier in church history whose name is passed down through the ages with this big, massive ministry. That's not going to be you. Rather, like Richard Grenham, you're going to be one of the countless numbers of nameless pastors who basically fill the bell curve of life. Just plain, ordinary, normal pastor. That's going to be your fate. And this is perhaps the first time I was actually really confronted with this reality in a very meaningful way. That in my life, even my ministry, I'm just going to be normal. And I'm just going to be average. I'm going to be part of the bell curve. So that's the first story. Second story is a conversation that I had actually fairly early on in our history of Red Village Church. And this is a conversation I had with a college student who was about to graduate. And the conversation revolved around fears that we might have. And what this student shared with me was something I've actually continued to think about. This is one of the handful of conversations that's really stuck out to me over the years. And as the student shared, his fear was that after he graduates, that as he gets a job, his fear was that he would just basically be normal, that he would just live a normal life. He was actually terrified by that, by just being normal, being stuck in the middle of the bell curve of life. So that's the second story. Then the third goes back several years ago when as a church we were studying through the Old Testament book of Exodus. And in that study, there's something I probably didn't take note of before, but something I've thought about, once again, pretty often since that time. And that just revolves around the very normal way that God was at work in Exodus. So now if you're familiar with the book of Exodus, you remember that at the beginning of the book, God was at work in pretty extraordinary ways. He spoke to Moses in a burning bush. There's an incredible series of plagues that fell on Egypt in judgment. There's a great Passover night where the death angel descended to strike down the firstborn, but pass over all who were covered by the blood of the Lamb. There was the parting of the Red Sea. There was manna from heaven, water out of a rock, a number of countless, or a good number of just incredible events in the beginning of Exodus. Right? These are not normal day things. These were unique, one-in-a-kind events that God did in Exodus. However, by the time we get to chapter 8, after these incredible events, there's almost like a shift, it felt like, this on how we see God at work in Exodus. And this shift started at a scene where Moses interacted with his father-in-law, a man named Jethro. And Jethro was able to speak into Moses in some pretty ordinary ways, giving Moses some really good ordinary counsel, which resulted in God's people being cared for in greater ways. Now, after that conversation in Exodus, there still were some pretty unique things that were recorded, but many events were to come where God was at work was kind of ordinary, fairly normal. In Exodus, God would raise up just normal skilled laborers to build the tabernacle with normal means. God would stir the hearts of his people to take up an offering to help pay for the tabernacle, right? In a very kind of normal way, normal means, right? That was how he was at work. And when I began to see this reality in Exodus, it began to shift in my own mind and heart. Just the glory of God that's being put on display just in the normal, the ordinary. Where we got to the point where seeing the normal, the ordinary is not something to fear or maybe to be disappointed in when confronted with, of just being normal, but to really see God is at work and he's putting his glory on display in the normal. In normal ways, through normal people, to guide and direct and care for his people. Right? That has been much of the story of history, whether it be from Exodus or to Richard Granum, or even in the book of Ezra, which we've been studying for several weeks. God at work in the normal. In the book of Ezra, as you know, if you've been studying with us, there's no miracles recorded. There is no really, in a lot of ways, no outlier works of God. But the story of Ezra is just filled with so many normal yet glorious things. God would stir the hearts of kings and his people. He would provide wisdom and instruction, all these normal things to help accomplish his will. Which brings us back to the text for this time here, which is a text I actually think that we all are going to identify with. Because all the different everyday life challenges and situations that we kind of see running through chapter 8. So if you want to look back with me at the text or work through it. As you do that, I do want to acknowledge up front some of the things I'm going to be pointing out today from our text, some of the application that I'm going to be pointing us to, is actually some pretty familiar to you if you've been kind of watching through these videos, or even backing up to the end of winter when you studied the book of Ruth. A lot of things that was said there, we're going to say again here. And so I want to be kind of upfront with you. I don't want this to be boring to you, in that this is the stuff we already talked about. So why are we talking about the same boring things again? Rather, I hope that going over these similar type things of God at work in the normal, I hope this has encouraged you to hear it yet again as you and I live out our ordinary lives, trusting and believing God is at work in glorious ways among us. So if you look at the Bible, in Ezra 8, verses 1 through 14, you see there we come to a list of names and numbers. In verse 1, these names and numbers detail those who traveled back with Ezra from Babylon to Jerusalem. So I mentioned this last week in our last video. This was a second wave of exiles to return to Jerusalem from Babylon, which just came up, maybe 80 years or so after the first wave. And this wave, like the first wave, they're not transported back to Jerusalem supernaturally. Rather, they returned in a very ordinary, normal way. They caravanned the 1,000-mile trip over 4 long months. And I think many of the normal everyday challenges that we would face, they faced. I'm sure they had the older people, complaining that they're going too fast. On the trip, I'm sure there was kids constantly asking to take potty breaks. You got the men not wanting to, stop and try to find direction. They were having conversations on whether or not they need to stop and eat because there actually was food at that exit. Or maybe they just wait till later in the journey with the hopes that there might be some more options or better options to come. Right? These are real people on this trip with real challenges, just really ordinary struggles, just like you and me. As you look through the list, just a few names, let me just point out to you. Verse 2, you see the names Phinehas and Ithamar. So these are the sons of Aaron, the brother of Moses, who also we mentioned last week was the first high priest that Ezra came through his line. In our text today, these two names are being mentioned and the genealogies that came from them. And this is a part of God's provision of keeping the priesthood in place. The priests are the ones who are in charge of teaching the Old Testament scriptures, carrying out the Old Testament sacrificial system, interceding for God's people in the Old Testament. So the priesthood is being kept in place through this line here. The other name to note is just David, if you can also see that in the list here. This is the great king of Israel, who God gave a great promise to, that through his line, the eternal king would come, the Messiah. So this list of people in our text, this is like God keeping his promises, keeping the priesthood in place, keeping the line of David in place to the Messiah. And this is really important. Right? These names remind us that God is indeed faithful to his people, faithful to his promises. And as he's faithful to all his promises, just notice that all these names, outside of maybe of a couple, we don't know really anything about these people. At this point, they're just names to us. As God was being faithful to his promises, he was using just normal people, just like you and me. People just in the middle of the bell curve of life, just like us, who had jobs, who had challenges, who had struggles, who had fears, who had depression. People just like you and me who struggled in parenting, who perhaps weren't as disciplined in ways they wish they were, who had friends, who had hobbies, who had interests. People just like you and me who laughed and cried. Right? This was what God was using here to keep his lineage in place, and this is who God was using to help further populate Jerusalem. Just normal people. He wasn't using outliers, but normal, average. And he was doing so in very normal ways, through very ordinary means of traveling, of relocating. Dropping down, verse 15, we see some of the details of the journey back, which our small group pointed out this week. Almost feels like a diary or journal here that Ezra is having for us, that he lets us in on, as he writes in the first person through much of the passage. We read that they came to the river, Ahava. It's probably some type of branch from the Euphrates River. We read that they were there for 3 days, perhaps to catch some rest before getting back on the road. And while we were there, we read that Ezra is kind of doing a little bit of a survey of the group, just to make sure he understood all who was coming back with them. And as he did that, what we read in the text, we see that he came to a problem, namely that he found none of the sons of Levi. There's no Levites with them on the trip back. And the Levites were basically the assistants to the priest, who were to perform a little more of kind of lower level type ceremonies and ministry related items. Very important though. And Ezra recognized without any Levites, this was a problem. This was more work ahead of them the priests could do by themselves. They needed the Levites to help care for God's people, to meet the ministry needs that were before them. So again, they needed Levites. This was a real problem. Now, if this was me, this would have been a freak out moment. Wait a second, guys. Hey, we have no Levites. Who forgot to bring the Levites with us? I can just see maybe Ezra and the others having frustrated conversations with each other. Hey, I thought you were going to be the one to do that. Why didn't you get the Levites? I can't get the Levites. I'm too busy packing everything up. Well, how'd you expect me to get the Levites? I'm trying to get all the kids to take one last bathroom break before we all left. If this is me, I'm throwing my hands up in the air here, muttering, complaining to myself. I don't have time for any of this. I'm already stressed out. We're already behind schedule. I just gave us a 3-day rest. Now we have one more thing to do. Just to slow us down. We got to figure out, how do we get some Levites? Just a real normal challenge here. How do we get help to care for needs? In our text, Ezra realized that freaking out is going to help get the Levites in place. So we see that he came up with a plan to try to get this all figured out. And so our text, we read a handful of names that he sent for, who were leading men, as well as men of insight. He gets them together. Hey guys, listen, we got a problem. And I really need your help here. I got to do some delegating. So you may have heard we have no Levites. And honestly, I can't be the one to go get them. I'm already stretched out the way it is. I'm stretched thin the way it is. I need you guys to be able to help figure this out. So in our text, he sits them down and he says, hey, remember Edo, who is one of the leading men in a place called Casaphia? Yeah, remember him? Well, guess what? I need you to go there. And I need you to talk to Edo. And you need to get there, tell him I sent you, explain the situation, and perhaps maybe he can help us. Now, scholars are not exactly sure who Edo was or the place where he was leading, but you kind of get the sense in this passage that perhaps this is maybe a training for Levites to help prepare them for ministry. I kind of wonder if it's almost like an ancient seminary type thing here that Iddo helped run and facilitate. In our passage, the delegation team, as they arrived on site where Iddo was, they do their delegated work. They talked to Iddo, who responded by meeting their request. And he sent ministers, he sent Levites back with them so that God's people would have all the help that they needed with the ongoing ministry at the house of God, the temple. In a very normal way, right? Crisis was averted. The stress, the uncertainty, right, is now lifted. For Ezra, this is a real deep sigh of relief. In a very normal way, God provided for his people and what they needed. Verse 18, we see that Ezra recognized this. And he testified that it was the good hand of God that was on them. In a normal way, right? God came through. Keep going to the text. We read that Ezra recorded the names of the people, the Levites, or the group of Levites that were sent back. I recorded that there was 220 temple servants who are going back to help. Once again, names that have now been lost to history in terms of who they were, what they were like. We don't know anything about their personalities, their strengths, their weaknesses, or even maybe specific roles that they would have played as Levites or temple servants. We don't know. But we see in the text that Ezra and God's people, they actually knew. These names, these individuals, they were important to them. Our text tells us they were all mentioned by name. Sure, maybe nobodies to us, but not nobodies to the second wave of the exiles. These people were important. They met a real need. They provided real encouragement. God used them to provide encouragement, to help care for his people, to ensure that the corporate worship of the temple would be taking place. By the way, we talked about this a few weeks back, just about the importance and the centrality of corporate worship. Right? Without the Levites, without the temple servants, right? Corporate worship, it really would have been lacking. And that lack not only would have had a negative effect on the overall spiritual health for God's people, but we know when our spiritual health is lacking, it trickles down to all other areas of our life. So this is important here for Ezra, for God's people. Right? These normal people filling normal roles to do normal ministry. And Ezra recognized this is a real evidence of God's grace. That God's hand was at work in this normal way. By verse 20 of our text, that major project was taken care of. That crisis was averted. Deep sighs of relief. But then verse 21, if you want to look there, now we see there's a new challenge. Another hard thing to try to think through and work through. Which, by the way, is that not the way how normal life goes? We get through one crisis, one stressful moment, but then there's always something else around the corner, another freak out moment around the corner. In our text, this next crisis was Ezra realizing that the trip that they were on, this was not going to be some type of casual stroll through the park smelling roses along the way. Ezra began to understand that this trip would be filled with many dangers, toils, and snares. That on this trip, real significant harm could come their way. And as Ezra began to realize this, he also realized he's kind of in a bit of a pickle here. In verse 22, he thought about asking the king, who already blessed Ezra and others beyond probably what they expected. He thought about, should I ask the king to basically give them an escort with a band of soldiers and horsemen to protect them from whatever enemies they might come across? That was an option. But then Ezra felt kind of awkward asking the king to do that. This is what we see in the text. Ezra already told the king how the hand of God was on them and all who seek after him, and his power and his wrath against all who forsook him. So Ezra's feeling kind of awkward here in this passage. Maybe even maybe a little hypocritical, that if he went back to the king for protection from enemies, perhaps this would ruin his testimony. And he didn't want to do that. At the same time, fear was mounting. Mounting with him, I'm sure probably others. He personally was feeling responsibility for this trip. He didn't want others to get harmed by enemies. So he's in this pickle here. What does he do? If me, I probably would have gone back and forth, a million times. What do we do? What do we do? Verse 21 through 23, we see what Ezra did. We see he decided that they were going to go on this journey and just really take a step of faith, trusting that God would keep them from the enemies who were ready to attack along the journey. And as they made this decision, as they came to this conclusion, we read that Ezra basically calls for a fast. That they would fast and pray, that they would humble themselves before God. They thought to the Lord, the text tells us, that he would give them safety to them, to their children, and their goods. Verse 23, they fasted and prayed, imploring God to work among them. Which, by the way, this also is hopefully a very normal thing that you and I are doing. As decisions are in front of us, especially ones that are sticky, that we feel like we're in a pickle, that are not maybe an easy answer, that we should humble ourselves before our God, praying that he gives us wisdom. Even taking time to fast and pray, which, by the way, on a little side note, I don't think this is something I've probably done a good enough job, leading us to do as a church. Just to really take time to fast, pray, humbly seek the Lord as big decisions are in front of us. Verse 23 of our passage, we read that as they fasted and as they prayed, as they sought the Lord, they recognized that God listened and he answered their prayer. And to say it again, this is pretty normal right here, is it not? Right? God's people had a desire to see him work, to care for them. So very normal means that they humbled themselves, they fasted, they prayed, and God was at work through it all. To keep going in the text, verse 24, we see Ezra and the others, they had more things still to figure out. And this time they had to try to figure out, okay, now what do we do with all the offering that we're bringing back? We're going to see just a second here, I'm going to mention this is actually quite a bit going back with them, which probably would have put targets on their backs from the outsiders when they learned about all the big offering that God's people were taking with them. This would have been also tempting, I would think, for the people going back to perhaps maybe take a little bit of the offering when no one's looking. Maybe I'll take a little bit of silver or a little bit of gold here when no one's looking. They're probably not going to miss it anyhow, or probably not even going to notice it. So Ezra, the others, they had to figure something out here. How do they be good stewards of this offering to make sure that all the offering that was taken up goes to where it was intended and promised to go? Right, there's another challenge in front of Ezra. So read verse 24. He set apart 12 leading priests and 10 of their kinsmen. And he gave them a task of basically doing a little bookkeeping. To go and weigh all the silver, all the gold, and the vessels. Everything that came with the offering from the king, his counselors, and that they were able to collect from the people of Israel. Right, to help, all this offering to help beautify the temple. So he gave them this task. All right, guys, you need to do some bookkeeping here. And as the offering is all counted, right, this is them trying to keep track of everything. And I said again, this is also pretty normal stuff. Right, this is what organizations do. Right, this is trying to provide some financial accountability. And this is what we do as a church. Right, we have a finance committee. We have policies for counting and recording the offering. We have accountability where the money is spent. We have financial reports given out at every members meeting, right, to ensure that God's money is being stewarded. And that's basically what they're doing here. They're trying to be good stewards of the money entrusted with them. So verse 26, 27, now we read the financial report that the second wave of exiles had. We see that they had 650 talents of silver. Silver vessels worth 200 talents. They had 100 talents of gold worth 100 cardiac. We read that there's 2 vessels of fine bronze, which was as precious as gold. According to one commentary, even though this wasn't an excessive amount and compared to the overall size of the king's treasury, this still was a pretty significant offering here. Especially when you consider they had to bring all of this offering, hoofing it back, 1,000 miles from Babylon to Jerusalem. According to one of the commentaries I read, this is over 20 tons worth of silver, another almost 4 tons of gold. This is pretty sizable. Honestly, I would have loved to see how in the world they were able to transport all of that, just through normal means to get all that transported back. In our passage, as offering is all counted up, we see that Ezra got the priests and the kinsmen together. And he sits them down basically to encourage, exhort, and basically challenge them a bit here. And he reminds the Old Testament priests in our text that they were set apart to be holy to the Lord. And so as they were taking care of this offering, they were to act in accordance with holiness. Ezra also reminded the priests that the vessels, as well as the silver and the gold that God's people took up as a free will offering, that this also was a holy offering. Right? This is something that to not take for granted or to be casual or flippant about. but to really set out and guard this offering and doing so with excellence, which is what we see in verse 29 of the passage. And if the offering was all counted up, the priests then were in charge and tasked to guard it all the way until they reached Jerusalem, until they were able to hand it off to the chief priests, the Levites, and the heads of the Father's house that are already in Jerusalem, so they could weigh it at the temple of the chambers. To basically, compare notes here, to ensure that all that was given was accounted for. And by the way, I don't think this would have been an incredibly fun job, to be a guard of the offering. I think as this job was probably being laid out by Ezra in front of different priests who are going back on the journey. As Ezra probably is about ready to appoint individuals to the task. Like if it was me, I'm not making eye contact with him. I'm hoping that he doesn't appoint me. Please not me, please not me, please not me. It's probably running through my head as Ezra is explaining what was about to happen here. As mentioned, this was a 4-month-long journey, 1,000 miles. And for day in, day out, this is what the priests had to do. Guard the offering. Right? This has been monotonous. This has been mundane work. This would have been fairly dangerous work, probably high pressure, high stress. My guess is probably even would have been a pretty thankless job. Who wants to guard the offering? However, verse 30, we read that the priests and the Levites, they basically did what was asked. And they committed to be faithful to do the work set before them. They committed to do their duty, even though it probably would have came at some real personal sacrifice. They committed to do it because they knew it would help the community as a whole. They committed to help bring the gold and silver to Jerusalem. Verse 31, this latest little mini crisis is now averted. God helped Ezra get all the ducks in a row with the offering. And because of that, now we read they're able to break camp. And they departed from the river on the 12th day of the first month, which in our calendars was been like April 8th, 538. And they headed out, trusting and believing that God's hand was on them. And they trusted and believed, even though there's no miracles recorded here. There's no real outlier work of God. They trusted and believed that God's hand was on them, even in this kind of normal stuff. Ezra recognized that the hand of God was on his people. Ezra recognized that God heard and answered their prayers, and that he delivered them from the hand of their enemies. And he kept them safe from any ambushes along the way. God was at work. His hand was on them. He was caring for his people in very normal ways. Verse 32, we read, after the long journey, they arrived in Jerusalem. We read that they remained there for 3 days to rest. I'm sure exciting as it was to finally arrive back in Jerusalem. My guess is they probably were just dog tired. So it took a few days to rest. But then on the 4th day, we read that the offering was now taken and dropped off at the temple, where the priests who were already present in Jerusalem, who are listed, started the very tedious work of measuring the offering and going through checking the books to see how it matched up with what Ezra recorded in verses 26 and 27 of our passage. Finally, our passage ends with the second wave of exiles worshiping God, worshiping the God whose hand was on them. Right? They came together, offering up burnt offerings. We read the offerings was of 12 bulls for all of Israel, 1 bull to represent each tribe, 96 rams, 77 lambs, as well as a sin offering of 12 goats, which probably also is one for each tribe. Right? They came together and they worshiped the Lord in very normal ways. And we see that they also delivered the king's commission to the king's satraps, who was like a Persian official, and to the governor of the province beyond the river, who God would use to help Ezra in the second wave to beautify the temple of God. And that's how the passage ends. As a whole, this really is a pretty great story. This is actually one that I was really encouraged by this week. This whole story, this is another testimony in this book of God's hand of grace that was at work in the life of his people. But the bits and pieces of this great story, they're just filled with so many normal things that in themselves, none of these actions probably felt all that significant. Right? No burning bushes, no plagues, no splitting of the Red Sea, no manna from heaven, no water gushing out of a rock. Rather, this is a lot of normal, everyday things, everyday people, everyday challenges. Just for a second, let me just point out again, just how normal and ordinary this is, just to kind of stress a point here. So by normal means, in this passage, God was keeping his promise of the lineage of the priesthood and the kingship through normal process of babies being born, of families, names being passed down, through normal people. I said again, I said this earlier, the vast majority are people in this list are people squarely in the bell curve of life. Right? Very normal. Through very normal means, God brought his people back to Jerusalem. Right? He didn't teleport them, but through normal means, they had to travel back. As they traveled back, they faced normal challenges that you and I face. Ezra recognized a normal need of trying to find people to do ministry. And he tried to tackle that problem by normal means of sending delegation to try to find Levites where he knew they were located. By normal means in this passage, God's people, they humbled themselves, they prayed, they fasted, they petitioned their God to care for them, to protect them, to provide for them. Right? This is very normal things here. To keep going, with normal wisdom, Ezra put structures in place to have financial accountability, to protect the offering, which was accomplished through normal people stepping up, making a commitment to serve the community in this way. The passage ends, more normal things here. God's people coming together, worshiping him, giving their sacrifices, humbly receiving help from others to come alongside to help them with the work set before them. This is such a normal, everyday life type passage. God using normal people to fill normal needs. Yet, twice in this passage, verse 22 and again in verse 31, Ezra recognized that the hand of God was on them and all of these normal things. Which leads us to two quick things I want to encourage us here in this video before I close. So the first thing, in light of all this, first, humbly embrace the normalcy of life. Listen, it really is okay just to be normal, to have normal struggles. It's okay that we're just a normal church. We don't have to be embarrassed or afraid to just be normal, to live a normal life. It shouldn't be a fear of ours. We don't have to stress out to try to be some type of outlier, as if that's the only way God and his hand will be on us. Keep saying it. God is very much at work in the normal things of life through normal people, just like you and me, to accomplish his will. To go back to what we talked about in our video from last week, just be faithful in the normalcy that God has placed you in. Be faithful to see needs, to meet needs. Be faithful to seek and use wisdom. Be faithful to make and keep commitments. Be faithful to serve. Be faithful to be humble. Be faithful to pray and fast and all of the normal things in life. Be faithful to the people that God has placed in your lives that know you by name. Trusting and believing that in all of these normal things, God's hand is on his people of faith, even as mundane and ordinary and boring as it might feel. Just trust and believe that in the normalcy, as you go and slug away at your job, or engage in discipline or discipleship of your kids, or serving the church in ways that maybe are less than desirable and at times thankless, just trust and believe that in these normal things, God's hand is there. Embrace it. And if I can push you a little bit further, if I can encourage you just a little bit more, right? The message that we love so much, like the wooden cross, empty tomb that means everything to us, this message, the message of love and forgiveness found in Jesus Christ, Scripture is clear. The only ones that receive the benefits, it's not like we have to be an outlier by working our way to somehow get God to recognize us as being different and special, and because we're so special and unique, then he is somehow compelled to love us. No, to receive the benefits of Jesus Christ, all we're called to do is by faith trust in him. The one who truly is the only one who's unique, the only begotten Son of God, who died in the place of sinners just like you and me, only to rise again on the third day. Right? Jesus isn't calling us to be an outlier. That's not the only way he will love us, is we are some type of outlier. He's just calling us to turn to him by faith, to humbly trust in him. That's the message that we love. Say it again. It's okay to be normal. It's okay to live a normal life. Jesus loves normal people. Embrace normalcy. And the second thing, and then we'll close, is see the glory of God in the normalcy. Now, all the different stories I mentioned to you earlier from Exodus, right? Obviously, God's glory is filled in those things. Those are glorious things. All the different unique works of God in the scriptures, they point to God's glory. But you know what? So do all the countless numbers of normal acts by God's normal people of faith that fill up most of the history books, that fill up most of the bell curve of life. God's glory is found in all these normal things as well. And really, it's incredible to think about the glory of God and how he's at work in the normal. In some ways, I think it would have been easier, you could just argue it would be easier, for God just like supernaturally in Ezra 8, just transport God's people back to Jerusalem, to supernaturally, snap his fingers and fill the city, to supernaturally just speak the word and beautify the temple. It's not like God needed Ezra or the people to accomplish any of this work, but that's not what he chose to do. Rather, how he chose to be at work was in countless numbers of normal ways, guiding, directing countless numbers of hearts. I can't even begin to imagine how many things God was doing in normal ways to guide and direct all of these things in this passage to accomplish his will. That's incredible when we think about all the normal things that God is doing and how he's bringing them all together for the praise of his glory, to put his glory on display, to build his kingdom that will not end. Church, embrace the normal Christian walk. Embrace it, trusting and believing that God's hand is on us in the normalcy. Trusting and believing that even in the normalcy, as we are faithful to him, that somehow he's bringing glory to himself. And even though in a short period of time, no one will remember us, just like the names in Ezra, they're just going to be names that people won't know anything about us, our God will know. And for us, that's enough. May God bless you.